but his prior books have greatly influenced me as well. And I'm looking forward to getting drinks and talking more with them later tonight, and maybe with some of you. I also want to thank Loretta. Loretta's work has been foundational in the gentrification field, and has influenced me, again, tremendously. And this center, my goodness, Loretta's been at the helm for a year, a little more, two. It's been two, but so much has happened. You got to look at the last annual report. It's incredible the amount of scholarship and events and dialogues with academics and policymakers that is happening here at BU. And Loretta asked me to be on the external advisory board, and it's a pleasure because there's nothing more that I can say except congratulations and applaud them because the center is doing so well. I want to say in this presentation, this is a book project that took me 6, almost 7 years. I've got 25 minutes. Now it looks like I probably have 20 minutes. But what I'm going to do is give you the main argument of the book. And the book is about the drivers of contemporary U.S. unrest. I'm a gentrification scholar, and usually my outcome variable is the community. How much did it gentrify, and what are the drivers of gentrification? In this book, I'm arguing gentrification is one of the drivers of unrest. The outcome variable is the uprise that we've experienced in the United States. And I've been somebody who's written a lot about gentrification, and I usually say, I'm usually neutral. I'm like, I know we can figure out how to do this and get investments into underserved areas with minimal displacement or without displacement. In this book, I say gentrification is slow violence. It is a violent process that stimulates and facilitates extreme frustration, and that frustration bubbles up. And when it bubbles up on the street, it is violent. So the book is called Slow and Sudden Violence, and the slow violence is slow policy violence. And the sudden violence is not the uprise. It's connecting the slow violence to the sudden violence of police aggression, the shooting of Michael Brown, the rough ride that Freddie Gray went on in Baltimore that killed him, and the knee on the neck of George Floyd that took his life. That's the sudden violence. And I'm going to connect the slow policy violence to the sudden police violence and then the uprise. Let's see what you think. All right. Why don't American cities burn? Michael Katz, who is a scholar at UPenn in history, wrote a book that was published in 2012, and he was motivated by the French uprisings that happened in 2005. And he and others wanted to try to unpack and understand, and when I say others, like Louis Quant, who looked at the black belts in the United States versus the red belts in France. And many scholars argued that the situation in terms of absolute deprivation was worse in the United States, but there were no uprisings in 2000 to 2000s in the United States, but France was burning. Why? Michael Katz wrote this book, and one of the arguments is that the U.S. had better racial representation. There were more people of color in political positions, city council, mayors, senators, than you had in France by the French immigrants that came from the former colony. So people of color had more racial representation in the United States, and Katz thought that was one of the reasons why the U.S. wasn't burning when France was. Well, Michael Katz died in 2014, and he passed away before the Great American Revolt. When I speak about the revolt, it's Ferguson in 2014, it's Baltimore in 2015, and other cities, but then, of course, we know what happened in Minneapolis. And Lawrence Brown called this period between 2014 and 2020 the Great Rebellion. Well, we had another rebellion in the 1960s after the assassination of Martin Luther King. But this time period from 2012 to 2022 dwarfs that in terms of the amount of protest and uprisings that we had in our country. What relates to why we had this period? That's what the book is about. So some contemporary unrest literature and the gaps is, of course, rightfully so. We've had so many books, articles, advocates out there saying it was police aggression, reform the police, defund the police. Of course, that is related to what we experienced. But we have so much scholarship on that. I wanted to address that, but I think there were other factors besides what the police were doing and did related to why we had uprises. There are situational factors. So situational factors, what I mean is the action of the police at peaceful protests, the action of counter-protesters at peaceful protests may be related to some of the violence that is happening on the street. Fine, we've got some stuff on that. But I think we got some gaps. We have few studies looking at structural factors. And when I say structural, I'm talking about city structural factors like segregation, displacement, and gentrification. We do have 2 books that focus on that, but these are the circumstances that the Kerner Commission talked about in 1968. But we don't really have a discussion beyond police about what happened post-2014. We also have very few studies, if none, looking at uprises and trying to understand a historical perspective, trying to connect the old urban renewal to the new urban renewal, and then the uprise. Let me tell you what I mean by those terms. The old urban renewal, we're talking about the United States 1949 to about 1971, 2, 3. The deployment of billions of federal dollars to local municipalities to raise Black neighborhoods, to destroy them, to put highways through them, rip down Black communities that had been divested and build some public housing. You see the Robert Taylor homes with the boy walking in between them in Chicago depicts the old urban renewal. But you know what? We also have the new urban renewal. And I've written a lot about that from 1993. Probably we could argue all the way up to the present day. We've got the deployment of federal funds going then to take down the public housing, to gentrify Black and brown communities, to displace people. So there you see a picture of Starbucks, and this is on the north side of Chicago. That's Cabrini Green. That Starbucks is there doing well. That high-rise is gone. And in its place are $400,000 to $500,000 townhomes. And that depicts the new urban renewal. The new urban renewal is slow violence. It is a violence that is, again, displacing and destroying Black communities across the country. And I am trying to unpack and understand how this slow violence fits in with the sudden violence of aggressive policing. So the research question is, how has the history of housing and community redevelopment policies set the context for the contemporary U.S. uprisings? My argument is that intense frustrations related to a cycle of racial and spatial repression, perpetuated over time by slow violence, cumulative state-led aggressions, help to explain the contemporary uprise. I do have to say that that idea of the cycle of racial and spatial repression, it comes right from Tiny's work. And you're cited in the book for that. And others, but definitely her work influenced me a lot. Methods, it's a historical case, multiple case study. Some people say, well, why Ferguson and why Baltimore? Because the Great Rebellion started in 2014 in Ferguson, a suburb of St. Louis. And then the next uprisings that we had was Baltimore. So if we want to understand the Great Rebellion from 2014 to 2020, I thought, let's go to the places that had the first rebellions. So Ferguson and Baltimore. My data, I'm an ethnographer, and I got to be in communities. So from 2018, 19, 20, a little bit before 20, I went up to Baltimore. I lived in DC. Went up there, collected data in Sandtown. But got all my data, felt really comfortable, felt really good. Then we had the pandemic. And I write in the book that I had a pandemic methodological mess, and I had to figure out what to do, because I walked every street in Ferguson through Google Maps. I started interviewing people in Ferguson online. And I thought to myself, while I'm sitting there in my basement, I'm never going to be able to do this comparative study. I'm just going to have to write a book about Baltimore. But eventually, the pandemic subsided. American University gave me the funds to get out to Ferguson. And it wasn't until I stepped into the Ferguson brewery and started talking with people, and then went to the Soul Cafe across the street and had drinks with people, and then walked the streets where Michael Brown was shot and killed in Canfield Apartments and Canfield Drive, that I knew I could pull off this study. So 20 interviews with civic leaders, visits between 2018, 2022, but a lot of archival work. And I'll tell you why the archival work in a second. So we're going to get to the findings. The archival work is because my participants, when I interviewed them, I didn't know what I was going to write about. I knew some theory about what was related to uprisings, but I needed to interview the people in these communities who had experienced it. And when I started the interviews, I would just say, what relates to why people hit the street? And of course, they would mention the policing, the aggressive policing. Then they'd say, but let me tell you about my grandmother. And let me tell you where she lived in St. Louis and how her community was destroyed. And then let me tell you about where my dad grew up and how his neighborhood was destroyed. Now let me tell you about how I made it from St. Louis all the way up to Ferguson. And I heard multiple people tell me that story. So they told me, if you want to understand the contemporary uprising, you got to go back. You got to go back to the early and mid 20th century to understand what happened in the 21st century. So I did. All right. Cumulative state aggression. Just this is a quick summary of what I'm going to show you. 1940s and 50s, the ghetto walls go up. The walls of public housing. It goes up to protect white-owned properties downtown, around the U.S. It's to stop the penetration of African Americans who are coming into cities during the first and second wave of the Great Migration. So the ghetto walls go up. It's a downtown protection strategy. In the 1990s and the 2000s, the ghetto walls go down. We knock down all of the public housing, high-rises, almost all of them, around our central business district. It's a downtown central business district expansion. The whites that Tanya documents coming into downtown and the neighborhoods around downtown in DC, that is happening in DC. It's also happening all around the country. Then we get the gentrification in the 2010s. We get increased spatial inequality. And then we get the police violence. Going to go very quickly, but this is the old urban renewal, right? This is Black community destruction. This is Mill Creek Valley, which is the Harlem of St. Louis, and it is gone. When you go to Shaw U Street, which is the Harlem of DC, it might have a lot of white people, but the structures are there. The history is there. You can learn about the great Black history of Black Washingtonians by being in Shaw U Street. When I went to St. Louis, I said to everybody, where's the historic Black community? They're like, what are you talking about? I said, well, where is it? They're like, it doesn't exist. I said, yeah, right. Like, where is it? Is it a place that you feel like I can't go? Is it because it may be a little rough? They're like, no, it actually doesn't exist. Black community after Black community has been destroyed. They were right. Mill Creek Valley is part of that destruction. When I went to Baltimore, people pointed out this highway, which is the highway to nowhere. It is about a mile stretch that was planned to be built, and this is on the south side of Sandtown Harlem Park. This was the heart of West Baltimore, the heart of West Black Baltimore, and a highway was put right through it. And that highway was never even finished. That led to the divestment and community instability and displacement. This is the old urban renewal. Then when people got displaced, the ghetto walls went up to house them and to protect the downtown. So this is a picture of Baltimore. You see all the green dots. Those are all high-rise public housing units that were built. You see dot 6, that's the Gilmore homes where Freddie Gray hung out. The area that's, I think you can see in red, that's Sandtown. So the walls went up all around the United States. This is Pruitt-Igoe in North City, St. Louis. Many of the people that got housed here were the displaced refugees from Mill Creek Valley. Well, eventually, Pruitt-Igoe goes down too. Serial displacement. Mindy Foleylo's term. We're going to talk about root shock, serial displacement, chronic displacement trauma. And I'm just showing you some of the policy moves that we made that relate to those concepts. All right. Let's get to the new urban renewal, 1990 to 2010. Again, we could bring it up to 2020 and beyond. Housing opportunities for people everywhere. This is our policy from 1994 to 2010 that deploys over $6 billion to local housing authorities to raise the high-rise public housing and to build mixed-income replacement housing. We have tax increment financing that local municipalities use to put public resources in the areas where public housing went down to stimulate gentrification. We also have policies like green lining. Tanya talked about red lining. So did Richard. Well, to address the harms of the past, we started green lining. Green lining with subprime loans, toxic loans that stole Black wealth, stripped Black wealth. These are the policies of slow violence that are detrimental to Black and brown communities, that breed intense frustrations that relate to the uprise. How am I doing on timing? Good. Probably go 10. We're going to just do a case of Baltimore. I don't have time to do St. Louis and Ferguson in a 25-minute presentation. But here you see the Inner Harbor in Baltimore. And right behind the high-rises that are commercial high-rises are the public housing, right? It's the green dots. It's the walls of downtown protection. Those walls go down. Between 1994 and 2010, Baltimore received over $160 million to raise the projects that were just in close proximity to the Inner Harbor. You see the Lexington Terrace in West Baltimore go down. They go down by being blown up with dynamite. And the people who were in these homes, they get displaced. Now, they don't become homeless. They get a Section 8 voucher, and they have to find housing in the private market with a federal subsidy. But Baltimore activist Reverend Douglas Miles, who passed away, and I was fortunate enough to do 2 interviews with him, and just an incredible activist in Baltimore fighting for social justice. He says, what amazes me is that they tore down all the public housing and nobody asked, where did all those people go? They didn't just disappear. Where did they go? Well, we've got a map here. The stars represent the households that were displaced from 3 public housing high-rises that went down. And you see that they scatter all over the place. Some people make it all the way to the periphery, make it all the way up to the suburbs. And we have sociologists like Stephanie DeLuca, who's at Johns Hopkins, and Kathy Eden have written about the outcomes for the residents who got displaced from public housing. And they write that some of the residents that made it to opportunity neighborhoods in the suburbs have pretty good outcomes better than some of the residents that were stuck in concentrated poverty in the inner core. But their book is half the story. Where'd the other half of the people go? Well, they just went a little bit further back. They went into Sandtown on the west side. They went to East Baltimore. And the concentration of poverty got worse in these neighborhoods. The conditions got worse. And the neighborhoods where they once lived gentrified. Neighborhood inequality got worse with our public housing policy. So the people that were displaced, they suffer from something I coined in the book, chronic displacement trauma. This is a multi-generational thing. When people said, let me not tell you my story, let me tell you my family story, my grandma, my grandfather, my parents. These stories of displacement throughout the 20th century and 21st century get passed down from generation to generation. And they relate to the old and new urban renewal. And this is a very difficult thing when you talk to people about this. They stutter and stumble, not because they're not articulate about the displacement, it's because it hurts. And the displacement trauma gets repressed because low-income people, when they get displaced by the state, they just got to move on. They got to survive. So they put the trauma aside, they bury it, they repress it, and they survive. But there is a repeated displacement. So let's just look. Baltimore activist Ray Kelly. He says, so it's like, instead of finding a cure or addressing the root issues, you're just moving it. It's a constant relocation of an impoverished people. Ferguson activist Felicia Pulliam says, when she talks about displacement, what that does is the pattern and practice of it, it's just an emotional and social toll. And with the taking of your communities, your foundation, and your roots, you're uprooted over and over again. And it just never gets, you just never get to that place where you're solid. So we got public housing, we got people being displaced, we got increased inequality. And I just wanted to put this one up because you see the red area lines. Those are the walls of public housing that go down in the 90s. And then from 2000 to 2010, you see gentrification. The areas in blue are the areas that gentrify in Baltimore. And they are disproportionately around the Inner Harbor and around the area where public housing went down. The raising of public housing relates to the triggering of a gentrification process. But we got to stimulate this gentrification process because these areas had a lot of concentrated poverty. We have to build and subsidize amenities for the gentrifiers. So this is a beachfront bar near the Inner Harbor. $100 million in tax increment financing goes to do environmental remediation because there used to be a chemical plant here. So it's a $100 million beachfront bar where you can play cornhole. But that demonstrates the level of inequality and the type of spending that we're doing that stimulates that inequality. So residents who get displaced from public housing get to see a beachfront bar be built near where they used to live. But then that brings on a lot of frustration. But then there's even more frustration, an additional frustration. Layer on the subprime lending crisis. The subprime loans in Baltimore and around the country went disproportionately to Black and brown communities. The areas that are dark, those are the areas that have 70% or more African Americans living in them. The area that's red is the revolt area, that's Sandtown, and you can see the dots are foreclosures. It looks like a beehive, right? And the foreclosures are also displacing people, and it's stripping their equity and wealth. Again, something Tanya talked about, but I'm talking about a little bit different mechanism of wealth stripping. This is what West Baltimore looks like. Abandoned, vacant homes where there once were homeowners who likely had a subprime loan, and then they got displaced. I said I would go probably 3 to 5 minutes more. I'll do it in 3. All right, so the walls of public housing go down, and then the walls of police supervision go up. We displace the poverty. We don't solve the poverty. The poverty reconcentrates in a place like Ferguson or in Sandtown. And again, Ray Kelly, the more enduring legacy of redevelopment has been the reconfiguration of policing strategies enacted to contain poor city residents to the ghetto. In the book, I call it the 1-2 punch. You get hit in the gut when your community is destroyed. And then you get displaced and you move to another poverty pocket. And then you get hit over the head with the billy club, with the stop and frisk policing. Baltimore Reverend Todd Yeary, he says, there is a persistent despair that contributes to a lot of the angst that simmers just beneath the surface. Folks try to live with a sense of dignity and commitment, but then there's the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back. The proverbial straw is the killing of Black men and women by the police. It is the sudden police violence. It is the killing of Michael Brown. It is the killing of Freddie Gray. I said the second punch is sometimes a hit over the head with the billy club, and other times it's a shot fired from a police pistol, or it's a rough ride, or it's a knee to the neck. After that, people can't take it anymore. The chronic displacement trauma that has been repressed for a generation or two bubbles up to the surface. It is released because of the police killings that surface the frustration and the trauma, and that trauma hits the streets hard. All right, let's summarize here. Cumulative state-led aggression, demolition of public housing, displacement, inner city or suburban gentrification, the resegregation of poverty in the inner city and in the inner suburb, the Great Recession, then that strips Black wealth, brown wealth, and then the police shootings. But this just isn't a contemporary phenomenon. To understand that term, the chronic displacement trauma, you have to look at the cycle of racial and spatial repression. The segregation and supervision, the dispossession, the disinvestment, the serial displacement, the reinvestment, and the gentrification. And it's a cycle. We did it during the old urban renewal, and we just repeated it during the new urban renewal. All right, the book kind of ends with an urban renewal unrest framework. We have all these ideas about what's related to uprisings and unrest. It's absolute deprivation. It's relative deprivation. It's the actions of the police. I want to argue that all those things are important, but residential upheaval and uprisings are connected. Why did we have the upheaval in the 1960s? Yes, we had it because Martin Luther King was assassinated, but we had 20 years of Black community destruction prior to that. And then people want to argue that it's because of policing, police violence. We have had police violence since the founding of the police. The police haven't changed. They are going to act the same. They have continued to act the same. I want to reform how they're acting, but I don't think they've changed. But what has changed? The new urban renewal, another round of Black displacement, brown displacement, increased frustration. And then the police violence triggers the chronic displacement trauma. Gentrification is a form of slow violence. It is one of the policies of slow violence. Subprime lending, gentrification, public housing demolition. So we have cumulative repressed frustrations that are triggered by sudden police violence. To understand the blow up here in Baltimore, you have to understand
that you're not often in a room where you can say the reason why I'm here is also in the room. So in the previous millennium, someone introduced me to the idea of gentrification. To such an extent, I ended up engaging with it for, well, until now. And I want to say thank you to writing such an accessible, interesting, and engaging book. You sometimes agree to do these things without having read the book, which was the case this time. And then you get to the book and you're like, oh, geez. And I can honestly say that wasn't the case here. So I thank you, Derek, for making the last couple of weeks much easier than they might have otherwise been. So as Loretta said, I've done work on gentrification. A lot of my more recent work hasn't been on gentrification, but it's kind of like a topic you can't get away from. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean gentrification is central to the urban process. So whether I'm doing work on urban policy or municipal finance, gentrification is always in the mix. And I'm not sure it was always as central, but it's kind of unavoidable. And I think all the three books, including Derek's, do a really good job of demonstrating that, how it's kind of indispensable concept. So I had 5 things that I really enjoyed about the book. And then I'll say criticisms, but they're kind of unreasonable demands in the sense that I want more here. It's like, okay, I've written this big book and you want more. So I apologize in advance. So the first thing I enjoyed was the centering of violence in the book. And I think it's quite a high bar to place violence as a central concept to understand the urban. The urban is a very, very complicated thing. And violence is a very, very difficult thing to morally justify. And so by characterizing the urban process via this moral category, it's a really, I think, an ambitious claim. And I think Derek really convincingly uses the concept and deploys the concept. So to see the city as emerging through slow processes which are violent, as well as these moments of sudden violence, I think took some skill. There are obvious, I think, dangers with that too, that folding everything under a highly moralistic framework, which requires significant justification, means you're operating in kind of exceptional moral registers. And I think there are benefits and drawbacks to that. But I think Derek does an excellent job of making a convincing case that many of the things we don't perhaps associate with violence are, in fact, constituted of violence. The second thing I think worked quite well in the book is the distinction between slow and sudden violence. Because I think it forces us to see historical continuity in the landscape. So the cases that Derek chooses are renowned for being exceptional. They are places of exceptional violence, but what Derek's work tries to do is just kind of steer us away from that reading and to see continuity. So the analogy I was thinking of was wildfires. And wildfires break out and they make the news. And then the deconstruction of those is really about the conditions which gave rise to those wildfires in the first place. And often that now is mismanagement, short-sightedness, a notion that we can manage nature in all its forms. And you really get the same sense from Derek's book, that this distinction between slow and sudden violence is doing productive work here. It also recasts the problem of resolution. How do we deal with these both long-term and short-term problems which are illustrated through the book? The third thing I liked, and this is my geographical bias here, is that it really elevates the urban process. So for me and my training, I can't help but read David Harvey's work in The Urban Process under Capitalism, and more recent interventions which have essentially tried to extend that around planetary urbanization. What Derek describes here is a state-directed capitalist urban process whereby social and urban problems are downstream of this requirement for the urban process to recreate itself. And so you get a sense of kind of deep theoretical grounding, although to Derek's credit, this isn't a work of abstract theoretical scholarship. It reads as a grounded, solution-orientated book. But so the fact that I was reading these theoretical frameworks through it, I think shows the skill of your writing, Derek, that you're able to tap into those understandings of the urban process, but at the same time remain grounded and solution orientated. The fourth thing I liked is that I think it actually does comparative urban research well. So there's a distinction made between Ferguson and Baltimore around plantation politics versus white racism and black classism. In other words, there's an attempt to make important distinctions around two cities which have similarities, which Derek is trying to draw out, but also making it quite clear that these are not simply the same types of places. And then fifthly, the thing I enjoyed and was really grappling with was this concept which Derek ended on, urban renewal unrest. And I think this is a core contribution of the book in that it really places urban renewal as a core social concern that in some sense it's a meso-level concept to ground something like racial capitalism. That what does this look like in reality? Well, it looks like this a particular urban renewal process. So I think all those things come out of the book, demonstrate that it's doing good scholarly work. It's really it's making us think and making us see particular events and particular places through a broader framing. So the things I had questions about. I think the first one was, this is a book of big explanation. So urban renewal unrest, slow violence, sudden violence, these are big categories which are used to talk about particular places, but I think the ambition is that they go beyond that. And so you inevitably run into the dangers of that kind of work. And so do we lose sight of important distinctions here? So are there different types of gentrification, different gentrification actors, policies, outcomes, which get lost within these broader types of explanation? The second area that I wanted to hear more really was around slow violence. That I think slow violence for me is an effective concept, but on one hand it does too much work, and then on the other hand it's slightly underdeveloped. So there was a passage that really jumped out to me. And Derek writes, I use the words riots, uprisings, revolts, rebellions, and unrest interchangeably to describe collective political acts against racial repression when different forms of violence, burning, looting, rock and bottle throwing, fighting, shooting occur. And I think I understand why those should be used interchangeably, but I also feel like there's a need perhaps there might be important reasons why they are different terms, why they serve as distinctions. That maybe they're not all the same all the time, and that we need to make that distinction. And I'm thinking here to the Paris banlieues, the London riots in 2021, where there's a whole bunch of conversations around explaining this. What is this? Are they representing something? Are they a direct function of certain social outcomes? Can we even understand them in those terms? So your book made me think a lot about this, and whether we need more work on thinking through slow violence. And the one thing that came to mind, which you made me go back and read, which maybe I thank you for, maybe I don't. So Slavoj Žižek wrote a book on violence, and it's all over the place. It's rambling, and you only really need to read the first 5 pages. But he makes a distinction between subjective violence, which is explicit acts of violence, and objective violence, which is systematic. And I think there's something really close to your slow and sudden violence here. That subjective violence looks like the sudden acts of violence that we see in the riots, and objective is the systematic, slower form. And this is what he says about it. He says, the catch is that subjective and objective violence cannot be perceived from the same standpoint. Subjective violence is experienced as such against a background of non-violent zero level. It's seen as a perturbation of the normal, peaceful state of things. However, objective violence is precisely the violence inherent in the normal state of things. And I wondered whether you could draw more out of that distinction, that it is almost slow and sudden are put up there for us to see, and they're both visible in the same register. And I wondered whether these kind of distinctions can be developed more. So I'm asking you to do more already. So I get the last thing I'll come to is the problem of policing, which is both central and peripheral to the work. So it's central in that policing, and it's where you ended your talk, is core and central, but you want to add more to that. And so you end up not talking about policing that much in the book. And I wanted to hear more. And so there was a couple of examples here. So for the past 10 years, I've been studying municipal finance, and policing is absolutely central to it because that's what the biggest line item is in budgets. And so you have a section which talks about the incentivization of policing through budget-related reasons. And I am the kind of quantitative nerd head I wanted to know more about that. It's such a small proportion. Fees and fines are such a small proportion of city budgets that to instigate action through those is marginal gains. And I don't doubt it exists, but it could be more sinister than you suggest. That it's not really about raising finances; it's about something else. And on that note, I also wanted to hear more from people involved in policing. So one of the things that has struck me in my engagement with police through my recent work is the kind of structural elements of policing. So work I've done in California on bankruptcy, policing is central to that. But policing is central because of the structural power that police and police unions have in urban politics, and that they're central actors. So on one hand, they're structurally important, and then on the other hand, there's the kind of voice of the oppressor. So when you interview police officers, you often get a sense of the fear that they have, the centrality of guns to policing in the United States. So the perpetrators of violence in the work, the consistent actor through the slow and the sudden in your account is police. And so I wanted to know, like, what is the mode of operation for policing in the slow moments, in the sudden moments, and how those two things relate. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Dave.
Wow. Mark, I got to say thank you for the thorough and comprehensive reading of the book. But actually, I need to say thank you to all scholarship that you produced that influenced me. And this is the first time we've met. But I feel like I know Mark. Japonica is saying the same thing because we know his work so well on gentrification. So, and thanks for that. I think I'll just stick with, the policing, because it was the last thing that you ended with. And I think it's a really important thing. All right. One, I didn't interview any cops because I couldn't get access to any of them. I tried. It is so difficult to get access to the police, especially in a place like Ferguson and Baltimore. But I can tell you that in Ferguson, absolutely the police followed me. I could see police all the time around me when I was going into the high poverty areas. And I just thought, Jesus, like, this is crazy. I also got a chance to interview the mayor, Mayor Knowles, who was a white Republican mayor in a majority black municipality. And this is Ferguson, who was the mayor before the uprising. During the uprising, he got reelected after the uprising. Even though Ferguson is 80%, if not higher now, African American. And when I interviewed him, he justified all his actions. And it's documented that he emailed the police chief and said, hey, we're a little low on revenue. You're raising a bunch of revenue. Keep ticketing people that are jaywalking and they're in the middle of the street, like Michael Brown, because Michael Brown was in the middle of the street and then was told to move over, and that's where everything spun out of control. 20% of the city budget of Ferguson at one point came from policing fines and ticks that disproportionately were affecting poor Black residents of Ferguson. And I guess I'm hitting on another point, Mark, that you made about the comparative piece, because I didn't mention this in the presentation, but I also strategically chose these two places, not just because of the sequence of when the uprisings happened, because Baltimore is Chocolate City. Not Chocolate City like DC, but Chocolate City like DC in terms of Black political empowerment. Baltimore is majority Black, and also the city council is majority Black. The mayor's there's so much Black political representation in Baltimore compared to a place like Ferguson, which has 80% African Americans, and almost all the political positions are white. It's white controlled, or at least it once was. And I thought it was important to unpack that, because if we want to understand racialized capitalism or institutional racism and how it plays out on the street, I think we need to understand how and why a place like Baltimore has the same types of slow violence, has the same police aggression, knocks down and raises the public housing, and it's Black controlled. So again, the race versus class kind of issues is something that I didn't talk about in the presentation, but I unpack in the book. And the white-dominated political structure of Ferguson is using policing to raise revenue for their budget, and then taking their budget and investing in the white area of Ferguson. But when you look at Baltimore, which is crazy, the Baltimore Police Department doesn't raise any revenue. They lose revenue because they're so violent that people sue the city and win. And millions of dollars is being paid to people who are getting roughed up and injured by the police. Policing in Baltimore is not a revenue-raising apparatus. It's a segregation tool. It is to tell the African Americans who live in East and West Baltimore, don't you dare come downtown. If you come downtown, we're going to crack your head. And you know what? We're just going to crack your head in your own neighborhood. Stay in your neighborhood. So policing is used for different reasons. But I'll say one last thing about this and then I'll stop, is that the book ends with policy recommendations. It isn't defund the police, stop the police. I don't think the police will ever change. When they step into a high poverty concentrated neighborhood with Black and brown residents that has a high crime rate, they're going to crack heads no matter what, no matter where it is. Bronzeville, south side of Chicago, Harlem, Shaw U Street, doesn't matter. Anacostia. Police are going to act the same. But you know what we could do? Instead of reforming the police, we could reform our neighborhood inequality. We could make sure we don't have any high poverty neighborhoods that are Black and brown. So when the police step foot in them, they are not on guard and they're not cracking heads. The police don't crack heads in white neighborhoods that are rich and wealthy. So the police reform is to reform the neighborhoods. Then I think the policing in those neighborhoods will change. No need for applause there, but anyway, let's get some questions if we have time, or
transition to the panel and then we'll have to put in. So that looks good. Or you did Bernie question, you have Bernie question.
Prowess. I'll make this very quick. First, I'm curious. I really appreciate you bringing in Zizek here, but I'm wondering why not also bring in his third interpretation of violence, which is divine violence, which feels very much in line with what we're talking about with uprisings as well. And I think that interpretation fits very well within this sort of uprising mentality. But I also wonder, to your last point, Dr. Hyra, the policy recommendation at the neighborhood level is compelling. And I also wonder, though, do we think that then that would just shift if we make less high poverty neighborhoods or even diminish poverty as a whole, that policing would then just transition to middle class, keeping and then enacting violence upon those places? I guess the question is, how do we not ensure that they won't just shift to the next sort of stage up?
I tell my students that like racism is playing whack-a-mole. we have so much racism that comes out in different ways and different policies and procedures that, of course, like we deconcentrate poverty. Hopefully we do that by keeping people in place and not displacing people. And we take out the chronic displacement trauma, or we minimize it. And then policing or some other policy is going to repress people. And then we're going to have to take that out. So I guess what I'm saying is that you're right. Like, but we got to keep trying. We got to keep whacking the mole down. And then when it pops up over here, whack it down over here. So you're right. Something is going to happen somewhere else if we address the core conditions that I'm talking about. And then we got to go address them.
Great, thank you so much. So can the three authors come up and sit with, or two other authors come and sit with Derek?
Okay, we're working message to add us as you and I share.
So we're transitioning now right into what we've called cross-cutting themes, critical gentrification studies